Roughly 10,000 years ago, at the very end of the last ice age, a surge of glacial melt broke through a thin barrier of land that connected modern-day Brooklyn and Staten Island, creating the tidal strait now known as the Narrows, the entrance to what would subsequently become one of the world's great urban harbors, New York Bay. This geological event would prove to be both a curse and a blessing to the human beings who would subsequently live along the nearby shores. The opening to the sea was a great boon for maritime navigation, but it also allowed salt water to pour into the bay with each rising tide. Though Manhattan Island is famously bordered by two rivers, in reality the names are misleading, since both the East River and the lower section of the Hudson are tidal estuaries with extremely low concentrations of fresh water. The opening up of the Narrows made Manhattan Island a spectacular place to settle if you were looking for safe harbor for your ships. But the fact that it was an island surrounded by salt water posed some real challenges if you were interested in staying hydrated, as humans are wont to do. In the centuries before the completion of the epic aqueduct projects of the 1800s, which brought fresh drinking water to the city from rivers and reservoirs upstate, the residents of Manhattan Island, originally the Lenape tribes, then the early Dutch settlers, survived amid the salty estuaries by drinking from a small lake near the southern tip of the island, just below modern-day Canal Street. It went by several names. The Dutch called it the Kalk. Later, it was known as Freshwater Pond. Today, it is most commonly referred to as Collect Pond. Fed by underground springs, the pond emptied out into two streams, one of which meandered towards the East River, the other draining out westward into the Hudson. At high tide, the Lenape were said to have been able to cross the entire island by canoe. Paintings from the early 18th century suggest that the Collect was a tranquil and scenic spot, an oasis for early Manhattanites who wished for an afternoon's escape from the growing trade center to its south. An imposing bluff, sometimes called Bayard's Mount, sometimes Bunker Hill, loomed over the northeast edge of the pond. Climbing the 100 feet of elevation that led to its summit opened up a spectacular vista of the pond and its surrounding wetlands, with the spires and chimneys of the bustling town in the distance. It was the grand resort in the winter of our youth for skating, William Durer recalled in a memoir of early New York written in the 19th century, and nothing can exceed in brilliancy and animation the prospect it presented on a fine winter day, when the icy surface was alive and skaters darting in every direction with the swiftness of the wind. By the second half of the 18th century, however, commercial development had begun to spoil the Collect's bucolic setting. Tanneries set up shop on the edge of the pond, soaking the hides of animals in tannins, including poisonous chemicals from the hemlock tree, and then expelling their waste directly into the growing city's main supply of drinking water. The wetlands at the edge of the pond became a common dumping ground for dead animals and even the occasional murder victim. In 1789, a group of concerned citizens and a handful of real estate speculators proposed expelling the tanneries and turning Collect Pond and the hills rising above into a public park. They hired the French architect and civil engineer Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, who would design Washington, D.C. several years later. An early forerunner of the public-private partnerships that would ultimately lead to the renaissance of many Manhattan parks in the late 20th century. L'Enfant's proposal suggested that Collect Pond Park be funded by real estate speculators buying property on the borders of the preserved public space. But the plan ultimately fell through, in large part because the project's advocates couldn't persuade the investment community that the city would ultimately expand that far north. By 1798, the newspapers and pamphleteers were calling Collect Pond a shocking hole that attracted all the leakings, scrapings, scourings, pissings, and shittings for a great distance around. With the pond's water now too polluted to drink, the city decided it was better off filling the pond and the surrounding marshlands and building a new luxury neighborhood on top of it, attracting well-to-do families who wished to live outside the tumult of the city, not unlike the suburban planned communities that would sprout up on Long Island and in New Jersey 150 years later. In 1802, the Common Council decreed that Bunker Hill be flattened and the good and wholesome earth from the hill be used to erase Collect Pond from the map of New York. By 1812, the freshwater springs that had slaked the thirst of Manhattan's residents for centuries had been buried below ground. No ordinary surface-dwelling New Yorker has seen them since. For a time in the early 1820s, a respectable neighborhood flourished over the former site of the pond. But before long, the city's attempt to erase the natural landscape of the Collect fell victim to a kind of return of the repressed. Below those fashionable new homes, in the good and wholesome earth plowed in from Bunker Hill, microorganisms were steadily working their way through the organic material that had remained from Collect Pond's earlier life, all those decaying animal carcasses and other biomass from the wetlands. The work of those subterranean microbes caused two problems at ground level. As the biomass decomposed, the houses above began to sink into the earth, and as they sank, putrid smells began to emanate from the soil. The mildest rains would cause basements to flood with dank marsh water. Typhus outbreaks became routine in the neighborhood. Within a matter of years, the well-to-do residents had fled, and the housing stock had plummeted in value. The neighborhood soon became a magnet for the poorest residents of the city, for African Americans escaping slavery in the South, for the new immigrants arriving from Ireland and Italy. In the squalor of its decaying infrastructure, the neighborhood developed a reputation for crime and debauchery that echoed around the world. By the 1840s, when Charles Dickens visited it, it had become the most famous slum in the United States. 5 points.